Okay, good morning or good evening, wherever everyone's joining us from. We're going to wait about a minute or two to give people a chance to join Zoom, and then we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so more people will trickle in as we go, but let's get started since we just have an hour. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Impact of the Pelosi Visit to Taiwan. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, and it's my privilege today to moderate this discussion with four experts who will enlighten us on key takeaways and perspectives of the recent events in the Taiwan Strait. Joining us today are Stacy Pettyjohn, the director of the Defense Program at the Center for New American Security, Yoon Soon, the director of Stimson's China program, Yuki Tatsumi, director of Stimson's Japan program, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Charles Wu, a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center and associate professor at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Like I said, we have just 1 hour, so I'm going to start us off with a question for each of our panelists before we open to a general discussion and Q&A. You can submit your questions at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Yoon, I would like to pose the first question to you. The CCP is approaching the 20th Party Congress, and of course, Beijing's approach to Taiwan is a factor in Xi Jinping's domestic performance during this period. So how should onlookers be interpreting the response to the Pelosi delegation in terms of the domestic performance factor versus signaling to the US and Taiwan?
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the great question. There have been a lot of discussion about how the upcoming 20th Party Congress and Xi Jinping's domestic legitimacy or domestic performance really affects China's reaction to Pelosi visit this time. And I think what you made, the point you just made, which is Xi Jinping's credibility, whether he would like to accommodate this time around is a good one, because such a visit does raise questions about Xi Jinping's reaction, at least domestically. When the public opinion and the nationalism is growing, perceivably there is a pressure for China to react more strongly. And that's the what they call the push factor. But there's also the counter factor, which is, well, if you think about it, Xi Jinping's Party Congress is almost only 3 months away. What is the chance of China to start a major military confrontation and a major military crisis at this time without knowing that whether he may or may not be able to complete the war or the military confrontation by the time of the Party Congress? I think for the Chinese traditional political culture, the norm is that when you have a major domestic political events come up, stability is always a priority, because you don't want to be pushed into a corner by both domestic political events and the foreign policy crisis. For any Chinese top leader, that kind of situation of being cornered by both domestic and foreign crisis is almost is almost a taboo. So I think before this time, before the Pelosi visit, I did agree that there is a point that Xi Jinping might need to react because of Pelosi's visit is seen as an embarrassment for him. But at the same time, we should also bear in mind that for him, stability is an overarching priority. Whatever he wants to do on Taiwan, he can always come back after the Party Congress, after he secures his third term. And next year, the strategic low tide of 2022 will be over. And he could do a long list of things. And in fact, he does have a 总体对台方略, an overall strategy on Taiwan coming up that will be implemented next year. But at this time, although we do know that his third term is secured, he also wants the opportunity to place his political confidence on all the key positions. So the political battle is really not about whether Xi is going to get a third term, but whether his victory will be complete 100% or maybe just 80%. So when you put all those factors together, I would say that the Party Congress is in fact a stabilizing factor for this time around because Xi Jinping prioritizes stability at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and those insights are really useful because from the perspective in the U.S., it can be really hard to parse those really fine nuances. And I'd like to turn to Charles next for the perspective across the Taiwan Strait. With these blockade exercises that recently ended, the sanctions on Taiwan, import restrictions on various Taiwanese goods, Taiwan really has borne the burden of China's retaliation for the visit. So how is this trade-off perceived in Taiwan, the benefit of the visit versus the punishment that comes afterwards?
Yes, I would like to discuss about first is Taiwanese citizens' reactions. Like what I say, this time, I think this is the most dangerous moment since 1995 missile crisis. And it's also the first time mainland China had a missile drill over Taiwan airspace and locates in the water of Taiwan. It's part of planned exercise in 6 zone sets. However, the local citizens have reacted to China's threatened military behavior with less anxiety, ensuring that majority of people's lives are largely normal. It's interesting. Then the question should be why people in Taiwan so calm this time. And I believe the first explanation should be the argument we call the background noise. Because for the past decades, when China says it may eventually annex Taiwan by force, this kind of voices have actually said for quite a while. The Taiwanese have been persuaded and educated by some argument that the military threats from China are just trying to deflect China's public anger or just to release the domestic pressure. So this is one why Taiwanese people feel so calm. And also there's another argument saying that China is not ready yet for an overall conventional military annexations. So this kind of so-called paper tiger phenomenon has again persuaded Taiwanese people that all the threats from Beijing are more like a background noise. Taiwanese people get used to it. To me, it's kind of very dangerous. So I want to point out a poll just conducted by one of our prestigious magazines, Commonwealth magazine, 天下杂志, on January this year. They asked about local Taiwanese citizens, do you worry about military attack from China in the coming year? The results show 64% of respondents say they don't worry about China's potential attack, but only 35% say they worry. So I think this poll has answered some questions why this time Chinese people are showing the less concern and anxieties during the military drills. And the second reason or second argument we can explain why Taiwanese remain calm is the U.S. security commitments. Since we know Washington has taken a less ambiguous position on the cross-strait relations during the Biden administration, and Biden has not only once spoken about his strong commitment on defending Taiwan. So the strategic ambiguity has become less ambiguous, but with more clarity. There's another poll conducted by the magazine, 天下杂志, Commonwealth magazine, asks Taiwanese people, do you believe U.S. will come to help when there's a war occur in the Taiwan Strait? And the result shows about 54% of respondents answer yes, they believe U.S. will come to help, while only 38% of people answer no. So we can see that Taiwanese citizens have strongly believed that U.S. will fulfill its security commitments after all the education and kind of arguments in the Taiwan society. So like what I said, this time we face a kind of a dangerous moment. However, Taiwanese people, they not like fully understand, and they are kind of slowly react to this kind of dangerous moments. However, I think no matter it's our governments or society need to tell the people probably the dangerous moment is coming in a short time. And then we need to face this kind of imminent threats from Beijing, and Taipei should expect more security assistance from other societies. However, like what I say, the foreign policy is very important parts. Neither bandwagoning or balancing against Beijing can benefit Taiwan. The best strategy for Taiwan still we call the hedging. Hedging is distinct strategy approach alongside balance and bandwagon, and they deserve considerably more comprehensive study in society. In the Taiwan case, we're facing a rising China and also a existing U.S. global hegemon. I say unless the dominant powers insist, Taiwan still have the room to choose a more communal side policy to manage the risk, or actually adopt a less risky positions in the foreign policy. This is what I want to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. That's very helpful to get that perspective. Stacey, I'd like to turn to you next. Of course, from the U.S. perspective, in the wake of the Pelosi delegation, U.S. ties to Taiwan seem stronger than ever. However, the PLA exercises also show how China hopes to make U.S. freedom of navigation operations and other access to the area around Taiwan more difficult in the future. So in your opinion, how might the U.S. respond to exercises like these, especially considering there is a heightened risk of escalation?
Thanks, Pam. That is a core dilemma that the United States faces right now in terms of how to respond. I actually think that the Biden administration's decision to not overreact in the situation and try to counter China was the right one. It prevented any sort of inadvertent escalation from occurring, and it let it be sort of a one-sided affair where it was clear that China was the one that was in the wrong and acting very aggressively here, and the United States wasn't further trying to provoke it or heighten tensions between the two countries. In terms of how it constrains the United States in the future, I don't think that it actually changes what the U.S. military would do and what the Navy would do in most circumstances, because freedom of navigation operations, especially those or transiting through the Taiwan Strait, doesn't happen that often. And during a crisis or war, we would certainly not be parking large surface warships like a carrier strike group in the strait. They would be far too vulnerable. If the U.S. were to try to respond to each and every time China decided to conduct an exercise, it could become an opportunity for China to impose costs on the United States. This has happened in the past in the Middle East when Saddam Hussein was going through a number of different exercises and continuing to feint and mobilize a whole bunch of forces towards Kuwait after the first Gulf War. So in 93, 94, 95, the US continually responded and several times deployed tens of thousands of troops to the region, and then he would back down. And that's far too costly. The US military has been struggling from readiness issues as it is. So we don't want to get in this spiral where we feel like we have to respond every single time. There have been past instances, on the Korean Peninsula and also during the Cold War, where we knew that there were going to be regular exercises and they might be used as the pretense for some sort of larger aggression or invasion. So we need to think about what we need to have in the area, use these opportunities to collect as much intelligence as we can so that we can distinguish a normal exercise from actual preparations for something bigger. And also take steps to ensure that we are prepared to respond Fortunately, a lot of US forces can move quickly to the region if they need to, Air forces in particular. We don't want the surface ships, the fleet, too close. Submarines, I think it would be smart to have them there collecting as well as to be in position because they don't move that quickly. But in general, the US needs to be careful not to overreact and not to find itself in a position where this ends up being a huge drain on it in a way that saps its actual overall combat power and weakens it. Unfortunately, it looks like China is going, it has crossed a Rubicon in some ways with this exercise in terms of how proximate it is to Taiwan, firing the ballistic missiles, and it could make this the new norm. And in my view, it makes a lot more sense for Taiwan to take steps to improve its capabilities and its readiness because it is there all the time. So that China knows it's not sitting by and Taiwan's not prepared to respond. So Charles's comments earlier that most people aren't alarmed by this is a bit disturbing for that. I think I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Stacey. You're absolutely right. This is sort of a new baseline for military activities around Taiwan. And I'll turn to Yuki next. That's concerning because several exercises actually launched ballistic missiles into Japan's EEZ waters. And Yuki, as you know, Japan has been taking a really hard look at its defense budget since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now we have this situation. Will the military exercises around Taiwan, especially the ones so close to Japan, have a substantial impact on the debate around the defense budget and reforms?
Thanks, Pam, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for everyone for tuning in this morning. In response to your question, I think my initial reaction is everything that you identified in your question, that Japan having a harder look at defense budget and defense reform. This has been intensified since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it was a steady trend since the beginning, for the last few years, at least. And this new development around Taiwan Strait, including certainly the landing of the Chinese ballistic missile in the Japan's EEZ, will accelerate some of that debate within Japan, and because it's one thing to continue to talk about hypothetical situation about Taiwan, PLA conducting a massive blockade of Taiwan Strait, how that could pressure Japan's defense posture. It's one thing to talk about that hypothetically, but this time it really kind of unfolded in a very real way in front of Japan. So this definitely heightened the sense of urgency, certainly within the Japanese defense establishment, but then also more at the higher level of the government in terms of what this means for Japan's defense moving forward. One thing to say for sure is, as Stacey mentioned, U.S. does not want to overreact in this kind of situation. So what does that mean for Japan in terms of what it can do within the context of the alliance cooperation? Japan's Self-Defense Force does a routine surveillance exercises around its waters and airspace. Maybe that needs to be intensified. Other types of intelligence gathering might need to be intensified as well. But then, what does that mean for the acquisition that they're continuing to think about? What type of institutional reform that may be to be thought into? What kind of investment priority that may be shifted? So there are a lot of questions that had been already asked when this debate started earlier in the year, when Japan officially launched the process of revising its 3 key national strategy document, including National Security Strategy, National Defense Program Guidelines, and Midterm Defense Program. So compounding effect between Russian invasion of Ukraine and the most recent development in Taiwan Strait will only accelerate some of these debates.
Thank you, Yuki, and thank you all for answering my initial questions, moderators. privilege. Again, a reminder to the audience, you can submit questions through the Q&A function. It'll be a little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll start off with a question from an audience member, Mohammed Wali. I will paraphrase. I think that this question is asking, is the US ready to fight for Taiwan? Would the US be willing to cast aside strategic ambiguity and actually commit to fighting on Taiwan's behalf? And likewise, would Taiwan be ready to face a conflict in the Taiwan Strait and all the casualties that that would entail as well? I think I will turn first to Stacy for the US side of the question.
On the political side about strategic ambiguity, despite the fact that President Biden has, taken steps that would suggest a stronger commitment that sort of diminishes the ambiguity on several occasions, officially the US's position has not changed. And right now, it does seem to be sensible to maintain the status quo, showing that the US remains strongly supportive of Taiwan and free countries everywhere opposing aggression, but at the same time not crossing what could be a red line for China that might actually precipitate the exact sort of invasion that we're trying to prevent. Is the US ready from a military perspective? No. But there are many steps that folks have been advocating for decades now that the US military still has not taken in terms of dispersing its forces in the region, strengthening their survivability by making improvements to bases, hardening infrastructure, redundant systems, additional logistics. We haven't purchased enough of some of the key missiles that we would use in this situation to try to stop an invasion fleet and sink it. But the flip side of that coin, actually, let me say, Taiwan also needs to do more in this regard in terms of taking some of the steps to make itself a very hard target and a porcupine so it can put up its best defense. But China also still has a long way to go. It is making significant strides in its conventional military forces, and it is developing a much larger strategic arsenal, though still significantly less than the United States. But an amphibious operation is a really, really difficult one. And even a blockade requires a lot of forces out and being willing to enforce that. And actually, that means shooting at any ship that challenges you. So it's not clear that China's totally ready either. And that it would succeed. In fact, most analysis and wargaming suggests that it would struggle and that it would devolve into some sort of protracted conflict for both sides, which neither would want to hopefully take a gamble on. But going forward, I think that more needs to be done to prepare to strengthen US and Taiwan's defenses so that they can defeat an invasion and make it never seem like an attractive option from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Stacy. I'd like to turn to Yuki next for some perspectives on the US-Japan alliance in this question, and then I'll go to Charles for Taiwan perspective and Yuan as well.
Thanks. To kind of add on to what Stacy has just mentioned, so U.S. cooperation with Japan within the context of alliance, especially on the military front, will play a critical role here in the escalation as all the parties involved try to de-escalate. But in the meantime, I think if that Rubicon has been crossed, what Japan should be doing to support the effort to defend the democracy in Taiwan, and what does that mean for Japan's self-defense forces? So I think Stacey just asked a question that is Taiwan ready to take this? I think the question that will also need to be asked is Japan ready to take this as well and stand with the United States to de-escalate first, of course, to de-escalate the situation, but if the worst come to worst, is Japan ready? I think that is one talk about the potential contingency across the Taiwan Strait has been either always kind of done in the hypothetical realm or in the kind of gently touched subject when the alliance conversation. But I think moving forward, this particular risk may need a more intensified discussion between the two governments and the militaries. I'm sure military side, there have been a lot of consultation and efforts to kind of gaming out the scenario has already been done unofficially. But I think this part could be an added area of focus or renewed area of focus.
Absolutely. And Charles, the question, is Taiwan ready? What is the Taiwanese perspective on that really difficult question?
Yes, I mean, jump on the question about whether Taiwan is ready and also Taiwan is ready for the change of strategic ambiguity to the clarity. I think I agree with Stacy and your argument and everybody's arguments. The function of strategic ambiguity is we call the dual deterrence. The first deterrence tells Beijing you cannot unilaterally use violence on Taiwan. The second deterrence is tell the Taiwanese independent movement people, if you declare any kind of Taiwanese independent movement, and then the result you need to handle the result by yourself. So this kind of dual deterrence is, I think, is a very important mechanism to stabilize the cross relations. However, we all know that since in 2020 presidential elections, there's a voices, and no matter it's in the United States, in the U.S. society or Taiwan society, they say, oh, it's time to change the strategic ambiguity, and you need to move slowly or gradually to a clarity, right? And however, like when Biden came to power, and suddenly people say, oh yeah, we are still maintaining we call one China policy. We still have this kind of strategic ambiguity. However, they're kind of moving slowly, like salami tactic, and try to use more clarity to explain the strategic ambiguity. And this one phenomenon is every time when the U.S. try to this kind of mention this we call this gradually move to clarity, that embolden sometimes people, they say, oh, there's more security commitment from the United States. Then this is one thing we need to be very aware that whether this kind of security commitments will embolden Taiwan to we call the gradually break up the status quo. Because we know that for the past decades, some person are being called as a troublemaker in the Sino-US relations. However, now we can see the scenario changed. The relation between China and the United States is the main decision factor on the closer relations. So we need to see whether this kind of scenario will change gradually from the ambiguity to clarity. And my next discussion on whether Taiwanese people are ready, I would say that probably we are not ready yet. Okay, if you look at the military services, the training, now the government talking about expand the military training, military service for all Taiwanese male from 4 months to a year. This still under some debate and discussion because young people in Taiwanese society right now, they still kind of resist this kind of longer military services. So we still need to do a lot of things to prepare ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And Yun, what are your thoughts? Is China ready?
I just want to add to what Charles says, who just made the comment. Because if you think about it, strategic ambiguity is not the goal. Strategic ambiguity is a means to an end. And what is the end? The end is the status quo of the Taiwan Strait, right? And like Charles put it, status quo includes mainland not unite Taiwan, but it also involves Taiwan not declaring independence. But the problem with strategic clarity is that, well, would that be a push to change the status quo? Because if Taiwan knows that, well, US is going to come and save us anyway, so why do we need to maintain the status quo? We should just declare, well, we should just pursue what we want. And we all know what Taiwan wants. So I would say that in this case, this debate about strategic ambiguity is understandable given the growing coercion coming from China. But it also raises the question, what is China's intention? we know that, well, according to Sun Tzu, the ultimate art of war is winning without fighting. I actually believe that was the Chinese trying to achieve. They're waiting for the U.S. to return to an isolationist posture and draw back. And like the Chinese would say, that there will be a day that the United States will be exhausted by a security commitment to an island so far away from U.S. Homeland. And until that day comes, Taiwan is not going to have the political will to negotiate unification with China. And that's how the Chinese frame and structure the peaceful unification eventually, because for China, coercion is not unpeaceful. Which brings back to US intention. And we know that President Biden said earlier this year in Tokyo that if China attacks Taiwan, the US would militarily intervene, right? And I think people take that as a statement of strategic clarity, but in reality, there are at least two caveats to that statement. The first one is China attacks Taiwan, meaning that China takes the initiative to change the status quo and attack Taiwan. And that does not really talk about the other scenario where is Taiwan tries to change the status quo. And the other caveat is, what does military intervention entail? Because if you think about it, U.S. role in the Russian war in Ukraine also constitutes military intervention, but it does not involve direct military involvement in the combat operations. So in this case, I would say that, well, military assistance also constitutes military intervention. So we're talking a very broad range of options and scenarios. As for Taiwan, whether Taiwan is ready, I feel the question is kind of unfair. Because we keep asking, is Taiwan ready? Taiwan ready to do what? To counter mainland alone? Or to do what? Are we really expecting 23 million people to be able to fight off China just by the pure gap of the military capability and also their national wealth? What are we really asking Taiwan to be ready to do? And the question is not fair because this is almost like a catch-22. We have a strategic ambiguity, so we're not telling Taiwan what we're ready to do in the event of a military contingency. And then we ask Taiwan, are you ready? And Taiwan's counter question is, well, you have to tell us, are we ready to do what? What kind of commitment or what kind of involvement is US willing to spare to help us? And that's how we can develop our national defense strategy. And we can be ready to do the tasks assigned to us. But if the task is that independently, with or without US intervention, is Taiwan ready to fight till the last man standing? I feel that's not a fair question. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoon. I agree. Charles, do you have anything you'd like to add on to that, the additional points Yoon has raised? Has Dr. Wu's screen frozen? I think so.
I think Charles just froze.
Yes. Okay, we'll hope that he will be rejoining us shortly. I'd like to tag on to Yoon's question and Yoon's points that gray zone coercion is a very concerning problem that really muddies the waters, so to speak, in the Taiwan Strait, makes it difficult to determine what is an attack, what is below the threshold of attack, and complicates the issue of what a conflict really looks like. So Christopher Woody notes that there are reports of China flying drones around Taiwan's outlying islands during the recent military exercises. Should we see such flights as Beijing trying to apply new pressure without doing something as provocative as flying manned aircraft around or over Taiwan? Who would like to tackle this first?
I can give it a try. I mean, sure. for China, and I'm sure Stacy has more insights on the use of drones, but for China, drones are much cheaper, and you can actually afford to send drones with the anticipation that if the drones are lost, okay, well that's relatively lower risk. And if you think about the EP3 incident back in 2001, where a Chinese fighter jet basically collided with a Chinese with a U.S. surveillance plane, and the Chinese fighter jet dropped into South China Sea, and the pilot died. The political consequence is actually much more severe, not just for bilateral relations, but also for the Chinese domestic politics, because the nationalism is immediately agitated, demanding for blood, demanding for revenge. So if a drone is shot down, or if drone just dropped into the Taiwan Strait, there's unlikely to be the same reaction. So I actually think that yes, drone is a much safer option, cheaper option, and also less politically risky and politically potentially destabilizing. Thank you.
That's a good point. Perhaps there are some forms of gray zone coercion that actually help us to maintain the status quo at a time like this. Stacy, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head there about the less sort of escalatory dynamics of drones. Also, just from a purely operational perspective, fighter jets fly fast, so they're not very good at loitering over an area and being harassing. So a drone that is slower and has more endurance is a better option for this type of operation, where you're just simply trying to be above to make sure that you're seen to be annoying and harassing and a little bit menacing, but not actually do anything much more than that.
Thank you. Charles, what are your thoughts from Taiwan's perspective on these gray zone initiatives?
Yeah, as the news come out, the mainland China used a drone on the Quemoy Island, and people say it's kind of gray zone coercion. And I think I read the news also. Our government, our military responded the drone with we call the flare. They use flare to distract and kind of get the drone away. I think this is so far the military's their exercise and reaction to this kind of strong strategy. However, I can see in the future probably this kind of gray zone coercion will come again on now our spread Kinmen or Maju, but probably they will kind of do more this kind of gray zone coercion to the Taiwan Island as well. I believe that our government and military, they have prepared some plans and strategies. Actually, they also discussed about how to prevent the gray zone coercions for the coming years.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to turn to Yuki next with a question about the U.S. and ally relations in the region. Nicholas Velas asks us, with reactions such as President Yoon in South Korea deciding not to meet with Pelosi, and India has remained silent on the issue. ASEAN has reaffirmed its support for the One China policy. What are your thoughts on whether the Pelosi delegation has limited the ability of the Biden administration to engage with allies in the region?
Thanks, Pam. Good question, and I'm sure Stacey may have some thoughts on it as well in terms of what might be what kind of a thinking is happening within the Biden administration on this as well. But from my perspective, yes, certainly just the fact that Pelosi's visit has happened in such a public way. If you recall, there has been congressional delegations visiting Taiwan, but it was not, it never it really hadn't happened at this level of publicity. I think the exception that I could think of is that then Speaker Gingrich's visit to Taiwan back in 1997. And that really put a lot of countries that have really complicated dynamics with China, including ROK and ASEAN, and of course, India, in a very tough spot of how to respond to these situations openly. That said, though, I think the way that China reacted by basically conducting such a aggressive military exercise, clearly basically declaring that it tries to practice to blockade Taiwan Strait, should give all these countries a concern. because these countries also have security concerns vis-a-vis China. So I think that's where perhaps other U.S. allied countries like Japan and Australia could complement U.S. effort to keep this partnership together and buttress the support for the more of a democratic principles and liberal international order and such kind of even if in response to something of a great disagreement on the policy issues, this kind of provocative response and reaction is not helpful.
Any thoughts from our other panelists on this issue of the visit and allies? Yun.
I absolutely agree with Yuki. I think what China has done this time has sent a very strong message to Japan that that China is prepared for potential intervention by Japan in a Taiwan contingency. And I think the Chinese are trying to send the signals to deter Japan from getting involved in the future. But the fact that there was a dispute about the Chinese missiles landing in the Japanese EEZ, I think that has been a particularly offensive or aggressive move as perceived by Tokyo. Of course, the Chinese reaction is, well, we haven't had maritime demarcation in that area, so whose EEZ that really is? We need to find out. But I think, that's all valid, and I think the question has been posed to Japan and South Korea and also other countries in the region, Australia, India. What does this mean, and what a future blockade, and not just a blockade of Taiwan Strait, but also the waters to the east coast of Taiwan. I think that's actually more concerning than just a blockade of the Taiwan Strait. We'll see what the Chinese do with Taiwan Strait next year, because this past June they just declared it's not international waters. Well, it may not be international waters, but at least 65 nautical miles of the Taiwan Strait still remains to be, well, the Chinese would say that these are EEZs, but warships have passage, even not innocent passage, just passage through these waters. So I think that's all worth discussing. But another question that I really want to raise is that, do we really consider China's actions this time around as offensive as it could be? Of course, it's bad, but it could have been much worse. And I think there is the political consideration, the party Congress. If you think about the Chinese, they want to put on a show. They want to show their anger. They want to defend Xi Jinping's credibility and his glory, but they could have done more. To this date, I haven't heard from either the Japanese government or the Taiwanese authority that the Chinese warplanes and warships have actually entered the 12 nautical miles of the territorial waters of Taiwan. And I know that for 3 of their the military exercise zones, they did dive into Taiwan's territorial waters. So what does that mean? What does it suggest if their warplanes and warships did not actually enter? I think another piece that I cannot verify, but I have got from different sources, is that for the Chinese warplanes that were participating in the military exercises, they actually did not carry the full load of missiles either. And that's something that I feel the military, from a monitor and surveillance point of view, you can see that quite clearly. So it also raised a question as for whether the Chinese were actually trying to push the envelope to as far as they could for this particular round. Not saying that their act was right or not aggressive, but I think they were also holding back this time around. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. And I think that dovetails with what I had heard. There was some confusion about whether any Chinese craft had entered Taiwan's 12 nautical miles. And I believe that the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense confirmed that they had not. Charles, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, this kind of, a lot of discussion, debating, because there's one photo. I don't know whether Yun or anybody have noticed that there's a photo showing there's a U.S. It's a PLA Navy. There's a kind of soldier using telescope, looking toward our coast, what's this Hualien coast, and you can clearly from the picture you see our electricity power plants and also the mountain, okay, from the POA Navy ship. And people say from these photos, this is probably less than 12 nautical miles, and it's very close to the coast. And however, there's another saying that this photo or this picture is fake. It's a kind of fake news. Some people post it and use like like another PowerPoint or something, or Photoshop. Sorry, it's Photoshop to photo the whole pictures. However, we are still very worried about that, since if the photo is true, which means the naval ship is very, very close to our coast. And also the government try to not reveal all the information to the societies. There will be a kind of signal to the Taiwanese societies. Are we ready yet? I mean, we need to go back to our original question. I think you mentioned that. Are we ready yet? Ready for what? It's very important. Yeah, I mean, in Taiwan, in our society, we are already get ready. I mean, the potential threats or attacks. Since like I told you, I served in the army. I mean, 20 years ago, and then when I served in the army, it's about 1.5 years. It's a long-term military service, and we learn how to fight. We learn how to shoot. We learn how to strengthen our military mindsets to defend our countries. I think this is what we call preparations. But if you look at past 10 years, our policies, our military policies, we reduced the military services years. Now it's only 4 months for a Taiwanese male to prepare and to defend ourselves. I do think the government should extend the military services, not only for men and probably women. They need to receive some military training as well, at least. So we always say we are ready for protect our own country, but we don't ready for any kind of this kind of called provocative or kind of initiation of conflicts by our own, and because we don't get in trouble. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I'd like to combine 2 questions from our audience members since we are slowly running out of time. Tony Liu, who's our other visiting fellow from Taiwan at Stimson, asks whether there could be, at what point is there a tipping point that could trigger further escalation, even up into conflict? And then also Christopher Dolan asks us, is the US being sufficiently clear that it prefers the status quo, especially considering Yoon and Charles' comments earlier about the distinction between guaranteeing security in the status quo versus guaranteeing security completely without any endpoint like conflict. What are your thoughts? I think I would turn to Yuki first, perhaps. From Japan's perspective, is there a tipping point that's being watched, perhaps, or an alliance perspective?
That is a hard, red line question. That is difficult to nail down, frankly. But on this, how should I say this? It is definitely a sensitive issue, and is Japan being sufficiently clear? Because what made it very clear to Japan is that Taiwan crisis will indeed most likely escalate or bleed into and become Japan's own national defense situation. There's definitely much real probability for this to happen. And in that light, because of the proximity of the Taiwan Strait to Japanese territory and territorial waters, it is a hard line to draw and what that tipping point might look like. But I think one thing I would say is, there needs to be some kind of a kinetic impact or kinetic or non-kinetic impact on the areas surrounding Japan, whether that may be something akin to the fallout of this exercise, such as missile landing, or there is a clear sign that there is some kind of an attempted effort to disrupt Japanese communication or power grid or cyberspace. But I think it'll be that this is like an ultimate gray zone situation that Japan will probably grapple with. And I'm sure people who are in charge of this is discussing this. But this is exactly the type of thing where ambiguity actually benefits it. That you don't want to be too open and public about what constitutes what.
That's a great point. For Japan in particular, the legal definitions shifting from a gray zone to an actual conflict are really important because they'll govern what Japan can do itself or in an alliance context. So that tipping point is really hard to pin down, sort of. Stacey, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So I do think that the situation could escalate further and that there's a risk of that. When I think about why China might undertake actions like it just did, there are about 5 different options or reasons for it. And this one seems to have been, signaling to the United States and Taiwan that their displeasure and potentially playing to domestic political audiences that are in favor of Chinese nationalism, as well as practicing some of these operations and desensitizing Taiwan, the United States, and the international community to these type of actions, so that eventually in the future, they could use them as a pretense for real aggression. Going forward, that could change. And if China were to be really trying to coerce Taiwan to change its behavior in some way, really expect some change, or trying to bait it into starting some sort of conflict where the burden of escalation would be on Taiwan and they would look like they were in the fault, but China was really trying to precipitate it, then it really does seem like it could become more dangerous. And where if Chinese forces like their aircraft were armed, they might actually respond in some situation, or if they're going to move within the 12 nautical miles to try to convince someone to attack them and respond to it. So escalation is a real concern, and I think a potential problem, though very quickly China has already done a lot with this exercise, and I'm not really sure how much farther it can go beyond those geographic bounds, or actually attacking some sort of force or seizing some sort of ship or plane. You think about North Korean provocations, and eventually they've moved into actual use of force. And were that to happen, the risks of escalation would be real. The flip side of that, and returning to something that we discussed earlier, is our gray zone coercion. And there is a chance that China could use its Coast Guard and the maritime militia to go out and sort of effect a blockade and put a quarantine in place in a way that it is harder for the United States or the international community or Taiwan to challenge it, because they're mainly civilian vessels, they're not military forces. And that type of situation could also escalate and could be equally problematic, though less aggressive, and potentially prompt less of a alarming international response as this situation did.
Thank you, Stacey. Dr. Wu, Yoon, do you have any thoughts on is the US signaling clearly enough that it would prefer that we not escalate to a conflict, or are we approaching a tipping point in the next some number of years?
Charles, you want to go first?
I mean, the thing I want to mention or say is we need to pay attention. Another thing is the economic connection between mainland China and Taiwan. This is, I mean, probably also respond, I mean, Pam, your very first question about what kind of trade-off Taiwan will face. And there's you know, for the past years, every time when Taiwan tried to struggle or fight for international spaces, we got some economic punishment afterwards. For example, they banned the groupers, they banned pineapple, they banned fruits shipping to China. And after Pelosi visit, there's another saying that probably the Beijing will unilaterally cut down the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreements. And I do not think they will gonna happen because this will be a very big issues on the economic connection between Taiwan and China. However, if you look at the news these days, the deputy chairman of Kuomintang, he kind of, you know, he didn't care anything, and they rushed to China to kind of comfort the Taiwanese businessman and Taishan in China. And we probably can see something probably gonna happen, or the Taiwanese businessman Taishan in China, they try to react some information to the scenarios nowadays. So we probably need to pay very attention to the all the kind of we call impacts, not only political security impact, but economic impacts after Pelosi's visits, especially after the military exercises. And the next wave of reaction from Beijing is on the economic and diplomatic sides. Thank you.
China's red line on Taiwan or on the use of force is actually pretty clear. Is stated clearly in China's anti-secession law back in 2000 that they passed in 2005. So there's three conditions for the Chinese use of force. The first one is the factual independence of Taiwan. The second one is events that would lead to a factual independence of Taiwan. So they didn't say what those events would be, but we can imagine constitutional revision or referendum would qualify. And the third one is the one with more flexibility, and you wonder what they really mean. The third condition is the conditions for peaceful unification have been completely lost. Well, what are those conditions, and who determines that they're completely lost, right? So so I think for China, the idea is well, they still state that peaceful unification is their preferred approach to unification. I think they will keep trying because it also depends on the U.S. commitment to the region, and they watch very closely whether there's going to be another Trump-like administration where the issues will become much more questionable. So there are a lot of moving pieces that the Chinese are calculating. But coming to a specific event, I actually think that by the next election of Taiwan, which is 2024, I think DPP still enjoys a very high margin of popularity. But we also know that the current Vice President, William Lai, has also committed that, well, he said publicly in the past that I am a worker for Taiwan independence, right? So you have to wonder that if he becomes a candidate and he wins the election, then that probably will stir up a lot of heartburns in both Washington and Beijing, and that's I think that will be interesting to watch. In terms of the guarantee of Taiwan's security and basically I think what that alludes to is a conditional security, conditional strategic clarity, that we will defend Taiwan under the condition of the mainland attack. And therefore, we exclude the other side of the equation that if Taiwan does something that lead to a Taiwan contingency, then we become much more ambiguous. I think that has been proposed and being discussed in the past couple of years, but I think the operationalization of that concept is going to be very complicated because the definition is very blurry. That, well, what constitutes conditional, and who makes a judgment that this is mainland's making and this is Taiwan's fault? So I feel that it really makes the issue much more complicated. I mean, strategic ambiguity, a lot of people complain about it, and I feel that every administration comes in and look at this issue and think, well, maybe we should adjust it. But then you look at the options, you look at the risks, and you look at the scenarios, and in the end, we circle back and come back to the conclusion that strategic ambiguity is still the most stabilizing position to take. So it's not without careful calibration, I feel that by each administration. But in the end, I think the conclusion is that, well, this is probably the least risky formula to keep the status quo. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. And we are running out of time very rapidly, so I will just wrap up and ask what each of you would recommend in just a few words, what you would basically recommend to help reduce tension in the Taiwan Strait so that we can end on a hopeful note today. See, Charles, would you like to start us off?
I just say very few things. It's just first, we need to be smart. Okay, no matter it's decision makers and also people. I always say we need smart people to lead the country, and also Taiwanese citizens. I always have confidence about Taiwanese people. They are smart. They know what to do. However, citizens, voters, they are innocent. They are manipulated by the politicians. So this is, I say, we need more information. We need more education. We need more kind of international engagements. We call omni enmeshments with all countries in the world. And also, we need to communicate with mainland China. This is a very important thing to secure ourselves, to prevent any kind of risky, to manage our, international security. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Stacey, what are your thoughts?
I actually think that the administration handled this well and, has allowed the situation to calm down. Going forward, I think the most important thing that the United States, Taiwan, Japan, other allies like Australia can do is actually take steps that increase their capability to effectively defend Taiwan should China attack, and that will ensure that an attack wouldn't succeed and should introduce enough doubt in Beijing's mind that they decide not to pursue that option.
Thanks, Stacey. Yuki, what are your recommendations?
Thank you. I think what's really important is everybody work toward one goal, which is to de-escalate. So I think that both like Stacey said, U.S. didn't immediately come up with a strong counterreaction to a Chinese decision to do a military exercise, but still call out on that behavior on the diplomacy front, I think was the right way to go. Japan kind of maintaining a unified approach with the United States on that was also I think a right decision for the government to make. And I think in the meantime, though, that this development of the last 2 weeks really gave all of us who are watching very closely, and many things to think about, especially the at how quickly can tension escalate, and how much of that can happen in a gray zone, and what exactly does constitute provocative or annoying, but not necessarily provocative behavior. So there are a lot of lessons that came out in the last 2 weeks. So I think what's important moving forward to reduce tension is everybody kind of take stocks of that and beginning to actually plan for certain things or act on certain things. And some difficult decision might have to be made. And especially in case of Japan, this would put a lot of pressure on Japan's decision on how it will equip and operate its self-defense forces, and how it would intensify alliance consultation with the United States and with others. So I think I think I'll just end at that.
Thanks, Yuki. The last recommendation goes to Yun.
Thank you, Pam. Between US and China, I would say that we need to observe China's domestic politics quite closely and to understand what will trickle down and manifest in China's behavior in terms of its actions in the Taiwan Strait. Like, for example, this year, many people are saying, oh, Xi Jinping is so assertive and China is being so bold. And my reaction is, no, just wait till what do you see next year? After the party congress, and Xi Jinping is no longer held back by this domestic headwind because of the COVID lockdown earlier this year, and also the international uncertainty associated with the surprise attack by Russia in Ukraine, which also created tremendous embarrassment for China and for Xi. So if we think that China's behavior was bad this year, I would say that, well, we need to be really buckle up for what might come tomorrow. next year. Thank you.
Thank you all. And we've gone a few minutes over time. So thank you very much to our panelists for sharing your thoughts in this really nuanced and really complex discussion today. We all have a lot of food for thought for the path forward in the Taiwan Strait, and hope we'll all be working towards de-escalation and stability. And thank you as well to our audience for joining us and sending in all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This will conclude today's webinar. Thank you.